Good evening. This is Joel Moses, president of the Photographic Historical Society of New England, welcoming all of those of you who are in attendance, who were able to pry yourself away from the Super Bowl game this evening. And we hope you enjoy the presentation we have in line for you. For those of you who are new, welcome for the first time. We probably have a lot of repeat clients, which we welcome back. On our website, you will see an opportunity for you to either join as a member or give a modest contribution if you so choose, all of which we appreciate. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Dana G, who will introduce our speaker for this evening. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Thanks, Joel. Hi, I'm Dana G. I'm the program coordinator for PHSNE. Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to mention a few things about the Zoom screen, if you're not familiar. This is being recorded for a future YouTube archive, and the controls for your screen are down at the bottom of your screen. If you move your mouse down there, mute and video are on the left. Please stay muted and submit your questions through chat during the talk. And if it's a brief question, I can ask Nicolette as we go, and we'd like to save the longer questions for the end. And then I'll relay those to her through chat. And then at the end, we can all sort of socialize. The chat little speech bubble icon is at the bottom center. And if you click that, a chat window will open, which you can move around. And if you put your question in there, make sure it's to everyone, which is the default, so we can all see it. In chat right now, there are some bibliographical resources for Nicolette's books, which you can check out and copy and paste. And then up in the top right corner, there's a little icon for the view, and I would recommend toggling to speaker view for the talk and then gallery view for our after session. And now, Nicolette Bromberg, who is our speaker, has worked with visual collections and archives for almost 40 years. She's currently the Visual Materials Curator for the University of Washington Library's Special Collections. Previously, she was the Visual Materials Curator at the Wisconsin Historical Society. And before that, she was the photo archivist for the University of Kansas Library, Kansas Collection. She's also a photographer herself, mainly working in platinum palladium prints. She's taught courses on management of photograph and film collections, visual literacy, and understanding photographs as historic documents and the history of photography. She's the author of 4 books: Wisconsin Revisited, Then and Now, the Wisconsin Sesquicentennial Rephotography Project, Picturing the Alaska Yukon Pacific Expedition, The Photographs of Frank H. Noel, and Shadows of a Fleeting World, Pictorial Photography and Seattle Camera Club, as well as a number of articles, the most recent of which is Loss of Vision, How Early 20th Century Photography Was Misjudged by Critics and How Archives Obscure the Image, which was published in Exposure magazine. So I will now let Nicolette take it away. Thanks, Nicolette.
Let's see if I can get the PowerPoint. Where'd it go? And I'll be ready to go. There we go. Okay. So a sad fact of our human history is that it fades from memory and that each new generation is left unaware of the accomplishments of those who have come before. For a long time, the work and achievements of a group of West Coast Japanese immigrant photographers remain part of our hidden past. These were photographers who became so prominent that, in the words of the editor of the 1928 American Annual of Photography, they, quote, put a lasting mark on photography in this country, the repercussions of which are echoing throughout the world. For many of these photographers, even their children and grandchildren were unaware of their achievements. Beginning in the 1920s, so many Japanese immigrants took up the hobby of art photography on the west coast of the US that they formed large camera clubs, particularly in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Seattle. The photographs they produced were exhibited in international exhibitions and published worldwide in nearly every book and magazine of popular photography. These large and active camera clubs were regularly producing and exhibiting work, yet a few decades later, most of the achievements of these enthusiastic and talented Japanese camera club members faded into obscurity. During World War II, when the West Coast Japanese American photographers were in internment camps, it was illegal for any person of Japanese descent to own a camera or practice photography. Much of the work of the camera club members was lost when they were sent to camps, or else hidden away or destroyed by photographers out of fear of the government. Continuing anti-Japanese sentiment after the war also made them reluctant to let it be known that they had been photographers, so they did not mention their previous work and achievements even to their descendants. When curator Dennis Reed created the first exhibit of Japanese camera club work, Japanese American Photography in America, 1920 to 1930, at a California museum in 1988, he sought out work of California Camera Club members, but it was a struggle for him to uncover any existing work as he prepared the exhibit. In an article with the exhibit, he discusses how much of this photography was lost by the end of the 1940s. Fortunately, however, there is a large collection of photographs and material about one club, the Seattle Camera Club, which was preserved through serendipity and exists today available for researchers. It contains not only a large number of photographs, but also records from the photographers, the club journal, which had detailed records of the activity of the club, and other materials. A few years ago, we put on the first major exhibition of the Seattle Camera Club and also published a book, Shadows of a Fleeting World, about the club. In the early years of the 20th century, Seattle was a popular destination for Japanese who wished to emigrate to America. By 1917, there was a vibrant community of around 8,000 Japanese when 38-year-old Dr. Kyo Koike arrived and began practicing as a doctor in the heart of Seattle's Japantown. Okay. While he made a living as a doctor, Koike was an artist and a poet at heart. He acquired an Eastman Kodak camera upon coming to Seattle and began to enthusiastically photograph. 2 years later, in 1919, 27-year-old Iwa Matsushita and his wife Hanaya arrived in Seattle. Iwa Matsushita and Dr. Koike began a close and lasting friendship, which was enhanced by their love of Mount Rainier as the holy mountain, a spiritual wellspring and subject for their photography. Yukio Morinaga came to the US in 1907 and is thought to have studied photography at the Eastman School of Photography in Rochester, New York. He moved to Seattle and began to work in the photography department of a drugstore owned by Yasukichi Kiba, an amateur photographer. He worked with Hiromo Kira, also a fine photographer who was born in Hawaii and educated in Japan, and came to Seattle in 1917. Kira would later move to California and do more abstract work, which you can see hinted at here. Frank Kunishige, another talented photographer, came to the US in 1898 and to Seattle in 1917, where he went to work in Edward Curtis's photography studio, which was managed by Ella Mcbride. In the early 1920s, Dr. Koike, whose office was on Main Street in the Japanese district near Kippa's drugstore, would take his photographs there. He would take his photographs there to be developed and printed. The four men, Koike, Kiba, Hira, and Morinaga, and probably most likely Matsushita, would often gather at lunch breaks to discuss photography. They were already showing their work in various regional salons where many other Japanese immigrants were exhibiting. Eventually, the men talked about starting a pictorialist photography group. Koike, Kiba, Morinaga, Kira, Matsushita, Kunishige, and a number of other Japanese photographers began to meet in late 1924. Their meetings were held at the Kyo Koike Cafe. Their dues were 50 cents. There were 39 charter members, all Japanese. Also among them were Fred Ogasawara, a highly regarded pictorial photographer who soon moved to Portland but still remained an active member in the group, as well as Hideo Onishi, a cook at the Paramount restaurant in Chinatown, who became one of the most successful members. Suichi Tsunami, who worked with Ella Mcbride and Frank Kunishige in Edward Curtis's studio, was a member, although he moved to New York City before the group officially organized. Tsunami became the first photographer for the Museum of Modern Art and remained there until he retired. He also became a renowned photographer of dance with Martha Graham and other famous dancers as his clients. Although the club always invited the wider community to join them, it remained mostly Japanese, although they had many close connections and supporters in the white arts community. There were some Caucasian members who joined the club. The most important of these was Ella Mcbride. Ella was a remarkable woman, a school teacher who started a second career at age 47 when she came to Seattle in 1909 at the invitation of Edward Curtis. She lived with the Curtis family and worked in the darkroom and in the front office. In 1913, when Curtis's studio manager, Adolf Muir, died, she took over the management of his studio. It was there that she met Frank Kunishige and Suichi Tsunami. When she opened the Mcbride studio in 1917, she took Kunishige and Tsunami with her. One other Caucasian, Charles Musgrave, joined at about the same time as Ella Mcbride and was an active member of the club, even serving as an officer. Unfortunately, none of his work has survived, other than a few photographs in the newspaper and a couple of Christmas cards with small images.
Nicolette, I have a quick question.
Yes.
What percentage would you say of the members of the club were amateur photographers who got their film developed by like Kodak, and who was working in a darkroom?
There were, I would say the majority, eventually it would be the majority of the people were amateur photographers. Kunishige, Morinaga, Ella Mcbride, Verna Hafer, who I will get to, all worked in studios, but the vast majority of people would be like Koike, who took his work to be developed by the photo store.
Okay, great, thank you.
Dr. Koike was the leader and the spokesperson for the club. Koike's energy and commitment to photography remained the guiding light of the club. He was always one of the top exhibitors in the group and showed his work all over the world. He wrote essays for national camera magazines such as Camera Craft, Miniature Camera, and Photo Era. He was the editor and writer for the club's bilingual journal Notan, which was filled with Japanese literature translated by Koike, essays on photography and other arts, monthly reports of members' work and shows and announcements, prizes the club won, and reports of the meetings. Notan was written in both here, Japanese and English. So you can see Japanese here on the bottom and English up here. The club was very active right from the beginning, and they also reached out to the broader arts community. Besides viewing prints, the club had guest speakers from Seattle and also international and national arts community. Koike was good friends with UW professor Glenn Hughes, who was a major contributor to the development of theater in Seattle. Hughes spoke on stage lighting at the second meeting of the club, contributed articles to Notan, and served as the English editor for the journal. At a meeting of the group in March 1925, Mark Toby, a painter and instructor at the Cornish Institute, lectured to the club on modern trends in painting. Toby, who was not well known at the time, would go on to become famous for his paintings that were clearly influenced by Japanese art.
Quick question.
Yes.
Are there any photographs of stage productions? You were talking about the speaker. Did they photograph theater?
Well, I will come to that, actually.
Okay.
I'll be coming to that a little bit shortly. Other distinguished guest speakers came both from the US and Japan. Among them were Dr. DJ Ruzicka, the leading pictorial photographer of New York City, who discussed European salons, as did Louis Fleckenstein, the leader of the Los Angeles Pictorialists. Visitors from Japan, artists especially, were honored guests of the club. Members of the club photographed together and learned from each other. Many members of the club were bachelors or married without children, and the club served as their social life. Hiking and photographing on Mount Rainier was a favorite outing for the members. And I'll intersperse here, we have some movie film from Iwao Matsushita, which shows the group up on Mount Rainier eating sushi and then going off on their hike. In 1920, Ella Mcbride, who had not been a photographer, began doing her own work, which was very Japanese in aesthetic. It was likely that she was taught by her friend Wayne Albee, a well-established pictorialist photographer who was not a member of the club, but served as behind-the-scenes mentor for the group. He also wrote supporting articles about the club, photographed with members, and was a guest speaker and served as a judge for their shows. In the North American Times exhibition of pictorial photographs in October 30 to 31, 1921, Ella Mcbride exhibited 4 floral views along with works from Kunishige and Tsunami. All of the exhibitors except Mcbride were Japanese. During the years of the club, Kunishige, Wayne Albee, and Mcbride worked closely together and often photographed the same subject. They even had a series of their photographs published in the 1924 Town Crier Art magazine. Ella was a friend of Nellie Cornish, who established the Cornish School of Arts, and the Mcbride studio became the principal photographer for the school. The school brought in major artists and dancers of the day who came as guest teachers and were photographed by Mcbride, Kunishige, and Albee. Among the famous dancers were Ruth St. Denis and Ted Shawn, Anna Pavlova, Adolphe Bohm, and many others. So this is Pavlova by Ella Mcbride, and this is Pavlova by Kunishige. And most likely they were photographing together at the same time. Suichi Tsunami also photographed with them before he left for New York. This is likely where he learned his techniques for dance photography, for which he became well known for. Ella photographed her artist colleagues and others, including fellow photographer Imogen Cunningham and her husband, artist Roy Partridge. Although she made portraits and landscapes, she became most well known for her floral studies, which used elements from the Japanese aesthetic. Her flower photographs predate the more famous flower photographs of Imogen Cunningham. Ella became immediately successful. By 1922, she had achieved world-class status when her work was accepted at the 67th Annual Exhibition of the Royal Photograph Society of Great Britain. Only 154 photos were accepted from the many hundreds of submissions from around the world. Of those, only 12 photographs were from the United States, and remarkably, 3 of the 12 were Ella Mcbride's prints of flowers. This Poppies, 1921, zinnias, and Life and Death, a study of water lilies.
Another question.
Yes.
I don't know who's asking, but regarding the photo of the club members, there seems to be a conspicuous absence of Japanese or Japanese American women. Is it known whether or not they ever were part of the club as photographers?
We know for certainty there was one woman because she's on the cover of the Notan, but other than her, as of Japanese women, I don't think there were any others. There may have been, and they weren't recorded, but for an absolute certainty, we have I think she was Miss Inishi, and she did make it to the cover of the Notan, but other than that, we don't have any other record of Japanese women. Frank Kunishige had his own home studio as well as working with Ella Mcbride in the Mcbride studio. He was an expert printer who experimented with various types of paper. He often printed on his own paper, textura tissue, which was a thin, delicate paper which he sold to other photographers. And at the end of this, I will hold up a piece of textura tissue because here you can't really see what it's like. The prints on this paper appear almost like drawings. If you can see and you look very carefully, this is Smith Tower, very famous building in Seattle, right here. It's very delicate. He was particularly interested in working with the human form. He worked with models from the Cornish Art Institute who were posed nude or draped in diaphanous cloth and made in controlled lighting to create an evocative mood. A critic said of his work, a touch of intimacy, eroticism, or mystery were ingredients that he understood how to handle. He made illustrations for literature and poetry that fit with mysterious or erotic themes, such as his work on the Queen of the Dead, which was featured in the Town Crier issue of 1924. One thing I want to interject here, unfortunately, Kunishige's photographs have faded, so the draping that you see would be more evident, but unfortunately it's faded some. A caption from the Queen of the Dead paired with this photograph quoted, "Silent and luminous floated from the dark, a face of sorrow, the magic gossamer garment, tenuous as fog, yet strong, impenetrable. Armor it was to guard against the Black Queen's sorcery." Kunishige's work was the most different and perhaps the furthest from the Japanese traditions. A Parisian critic said, among the Japanese workers who have cut adrift from Oriental tradition, none has so perfectly adapted himself as he. Koike and Matsushita, who shared a deep reverence for Mount Rainier, were very prolific and found their inspiration and imagery in nature. People in their photographs were mainly used as design elements. Matsushita, his wife Hanae, and Koike were on the mountain together weekly. So figures appearing in Koike's photographs of the mountain are most likely Iwa Matsushita or Hanae, and figures in Matsushita's photographs are most likely Koike. Much of their work was of the natural world. Yukio Morinaga did very different work, focusing on urban scenes. His work was less romantic, but concentrating on the working man and human activities in the landscape. But his composition and lighting had a similar use of shadow and spaces. Sadly, we do not know much about Kutsura Matsuki's work, but it appears to have been similar to Morinaga's. We have one photograph, Sunlight in the Morning, by him. It would be the color that you saw previously, but this is actually a copy of his work, a more modern copy. And another photograph of a train at a station, which is printed in a magazine, which is quite similar to a Kunishige image of a train. They most likely were photographing together. The club continued to invite Caucasian members, but without much success. But during the last year of the club, Verna Hafer, who had a photography studio, joined the club and showed with them. Yukio Morinaga and Verna Hafer became very close friends, and Morinaga went to work for her in her studio. The club and its members were amazingly successful in a short period of time. They organized in 1924 and put on their first juried exhibition in 1925. By their fourth and fifth shows, they had over 1,000 prints submitted from all over the world. The success of the club peaked in 1926 when 589 photographs from 20 members were accepted at 33 salons around the world. A Shirley Poppy by Ella Mcbride was the most popular. It was accepted in 15 salons that year. One of a Day by Onishi was accepted into 10 salons. Two photos, Betty by Kunishige and Hamadryad by Kunishige, and Magellans of Today were accepted into 9 salons. Looking Down Emmons Glacier by Koike and The Magic Vase by Ella Mcbride were in 7 salons. That year, Ella Mcbride became the 6th most exhibited pictorialist in the world. During the peak of the club activities, 1926 to 1927, 7 of the top 10 most exhibited pictorial photographers in the world were members. The most noted prize-winning members were Koike, Frank Kunishige, Hiromu Kira, Hideo Onishi, Yukio Morinaga, Fred Ogasawara, and Ella Mcbride. Koike was invited to join the Royal British Photography Society, the only Japanese member at the time. Koike kept albums with a photograph on one page and exhibition tags on the facing page, which showed all the shows that the photo was in. The tags are placed over each other, and in one case, there are 40 exhibition tags for a photo that he showed all over the world. Though the majority of the members were beginners, they kept winning prizes. In 1926, the club was congratulated in the Viewfinder, the official bulletin of the California Camera Club. We noticed that SCC has won the cup offered by Photo Era for the club whose members win the most prizes in the Photo Era monthly competitions during the past year. The members of the SCC are real, hard, and honest workers, and the club is now one of the leaders in pictorialist work. Congratulations, SCC 1925-26 winner. In 1928, the journal Photograms reported that the greatest activity seems to be among the Japanese of the Pacific Coast. Competition among them has led to the development of an individuality that has furnished a new note to many exhibitions. The American Annual of Photography reported that there had been 762 prints hung that were by Japanese photographers in the 3 Pacific states, in contrast to only 23 by non-Japanese photographers from the same region. The club was in touch with pictorialists all across the world. Dr. Koike received Christmas or season's greetings cards from photographers from across the US and places such as Uruguay, England, Japan, Russia, Czechoslovakia, and many more. Members of the club also sent cards with small photographs. These cards sometimes would be the only example that we have of a Seattle Camera Club member's work. But by 1929, the club began to fail as many members could no longer afford to do photography. Fewer of them brought prints to the meetings and attendance fell. Since many of them worked in low-paying jobs, the bad financial times made it difficult for them to continue with their hobby. The club had its last meeting in October 1929, and the last edition of the NOTAN reported, "We decided to disband our Seattle Camera Club because of non-activities and financial difficulties for most of the members. We owe our success in the past to all our friends here and there, and we are sorry we cannot stand anymore any longer, even with their encouragement. Some of the members continued to photograph, those like Koike and Matsushita, who had enough money to continue, or Kunishige and Morinaga, who were photographers by occupation. Ella Mcbride continued to operate her studio, but soon stopped doing her own personal work. Onishi and some other members returned to Japan in the 1930s. Verna Hafer continued to run her studio and remained close friends with Morinaga. On Pearl Harbor Day, December 7, 1941, Iwao Matsushita was arrested a few hours after Pearl Harbor happened. The fact that he was bilingual, a teacher, and a member of the Japanese organizations such as the Haiku Club identified him as a community leader and an intellectual elitist whose loyalty was suspect. He was sent to a detention camp in Fort Missoula, Montana, while the government decided what to do with him. Later, his wife Hanaya and friends Koike, Morinaga, Kunishige, and other former Camera Club members were interned in Minnedoka in Idaho. Matsushita was kept in a detention camp apart from his wife and friends, even though there was no evidence he had ever done anything anti-American. Koike and Matsushita corresponded almost weekly. They talked about how they especially missed climbing in the mountains. After the war, in 1947, Koike died suddenly while out picking spring fern shoots on Mount Rainier, and all his photography and the papers and the writing were left to Matsushita. Morinaga remained close with Verna Hafer, who took care of him for the rest of his life, which he spent in relative poverty after his internment. Hafer bought him a house where he could live and work and remained a source of strength and support for him, but he never really recovered from the internment experience, and when he was 80, he starved himself to death. Most of his work was lost, except for some prints that remain with Hafer's descendants and in a few other hands. While he was interned in Minnedoka in Idaho, Kunishige was eventually able to go to work for a photography studio in Twin Falls, Idaho, before the end of the war and before he left internment. He must have found part of the community welcoming because he was invited to show his photographs to the 20th Century Club. An article in the Twin Falls Telegram of July 16, 1945, exhibit of internationally known photographer here, read, Mr. Kunishige, who has had a photo studio in Seattle for 30 years, has resided in Twin Falls during the past 2.5 years. A noted artist has made this statement of the photographer and his work. Frank Kunishige's name is Japanese, but his pictures are American. Ella Mcbride never married, and although she continued to run her studio, she never did any more personal work or exhibited. She lived to be 103. Frank Kunishige died in 1960, and his widow, Jin, married Iwao Matsushita, who had lost his wife, thus bringing together what remained of the work of 3 members of the Seattle Camera Club. Collecting decisions made by institutions have a major influence on the selection of what is preserved for our historical record. As places where our photographic heritage is stored, museums and historical archives are the gatekeepers deciding which photographer's work will be preserved for future generations. The head of the UW Library's special collections in the 1970s, Robert Monroe, was ahead of his time regarding collecting photography. Monroe recognized the broader value of photographs in the historical record when photography wasn't seen as important. He was also able to see the value of collecting a type of photography which normally would be rejected in historical archives at this time. These images of personal expression did not fit within the model that required a photograph to be documentary in nature. Monroe's philosophy was that it was his responsibility to anticipate the needs of future scholars, to see 50 or 100 years into the future. He believed in the importance of the Seattle Camera Club work at a time when photography was relegated to the back rooms of archives, and also when pictorial photography was of very little interest in the world of art photography and also would be rejected for collecting. Iwao Matsushita was eventually hired to teach Japanese at the University of Washington. Monroe worked with Matsushita to encourage him to donate his collection. Matsushita left his papers and photographs, as well as the photographic work of Koike and Kunishige and the Camera Club records, to the University of Washington before his death in 1979, which resulted in the preservation of a large portion of the history of the Seattle Camera Club. This is the largest record of a Japanese camera club that exists. And as a side anecdote, to point out how important collecting decisions are, in the 1990s, my predecessor, who was a historian and not a visual person, was offered some of Ella Mcbride's photographs, which he turned down, saying, "We don't collect art." A thing that very much upsets me to this day. In the 1920s, pictorial photography was a perfect fit for these Japanese Americans, with its emphasis on nature and emotion and presenting the photograph as art. It has been suggested that for these immigrants, photography was a convenient way of maintaining their cultural heritage of arts and aesthetics. They came from a culture that prized art and design in daily life. At the same time, they could also participate in the American mainstream, sharing a common interest and a visual language with the broader photographic community, yet not being constrained by language barriers.
Nicolette, someone has asked, sorry to interrupt, has any current day camera club taken up the name Seattle Camera Club?
There actually was a Seattle Camera Club in 1895, which died out. And then in the 1930s, there was the Seattle Photographic Society. So Seattle Camera Club as a name hasn't been taken up again. But by the 1940s, Japanese citizens were not allowed to do photography during the war, and it became connected with the shame of internment. So many Japanese photographers hid or destroyed their work. Most of the work of the West Coast Japanese Camera Club photographers was lost or hidden, and their accomplishments were forgotten, both ignored because of racism heightened by the war and because of the reaction against pictorialism in photography. We are truly fortunate to have this record of the Seattle Camera Club. Dr. Koike's words in Photo Era remain. Now we are all Japanese living in America. You can see that it is clear what the members of the Seattle Camera Club should do for the advancement of photographic art. Yes, we must be the best interpreters for both nations because we are not free of Japanese ideas. And yet at the same time, we understand Western ways. We should not make our pictures aimlessly, but must try hard to combine both ideas. In other words, stick to our particular point of view. To add something new and valuable to the photographic circle is not a bad plan. And that's my talk.
Thank you.
And
everyone unmute so you can applaud.
And I will show you, if you can see it.
Great job,
I don't know if can you see this?
Yes.
How delicate, this is how delicate this paper is. You can actually see through it. So it's a very interesting paper. So I'm glad to have questions or comments.
About that paper, Nicolette, how does the paper work? Is that paper go for the printing only?
He has, actually the instructions are on this. And he says exposure, the printing is done in a printing frame, so it was ready to expose. He's got toning and fixing instructions on here and tells you how to dry it and mount it using white paste only. So it was ready to go. It says the printing is done in a printing frame. It was for contact printing, in a printing frame under a negative and exposing to a strong source of light. The sensitized side of the paper is marked with an X. The visual image appears as the exposed proceeds. It's like printing out paper is what it was like. It is advisable to print in the shade outdoors. If the printing is to be done under the direct sunlight, it is advisable to cover the printing frame with 1 or 2 sheets of white tissue paper to soften the strong light, especially when a thin negative is being printed. Otherwise, the contrast may be insufficient. And then after printing it, you wash the prints in several changes of water for 5 minutes, then wash them thoroughly under a slow stream of running water. It takes about 15 minutes for a small 5x7 print. Avoid running the water directly on the prints as the paper is fragile. And then it tells you how to tone it. They're toned with Textura toning solution, which is prepared especially for use with Textura tissue. So we are very lucky to have this as a record of his paper and what he used.
Mary has a question for you. How interesting that the flower pictures of this Seattle Camera Club came before Imogen Cunningham's. So what more can you tell us about the relationship between Imogen Roy Partridge and the SCC?
Ella Mcbride definitely knew Imogen and Roy. So they knew each other, so they obviously saw each other's work. I'm certain of that, obviously, because Ella was exhibiting and she was exhibiting her flower photos. So it's inconceivable to me that Imogen didn't see this work.
Larry has a question. Many of the pictures are low contrast or do not have very dense black tones. So go ahead.
Part of that is fading. Part of that is the fading. I think if I can go back for a second to see. Can you see this? Do I have share on?
You can see
Yes.
it.
Yeah, Koikes tend to have fairly good blacks in them, but unfortunately, Kunishige's work has definitely deteriorated. But I think also because they were working with, they were not working with black and white too. So what you see is starting from a brown. Here's a Kunishige, so you can see more of it. This is a Kunishige that is from Textura tissue. So you don't, if you can see the texture of the actual paper there. So when you look through it, unless you put a backing on it, it doesn't seem to be quite as dark as it might be. Here's a Betty where you can see a little bit more.
How stable is the tissue paper as far as preserving?
Well, you know, these are tissue, or this one is definitely tissue. You can see that it worked here. And I don't think it's that stable. Sadly, it's not, because I know that this, you could see all of this. A little bit more like you can see here. You could see all of this, I know. So I know that this is faded quite a bit. But then here we have Koike, whose work you can see more of the black and the whites and is more stable. Here's another one. You see that it's more stable. So here, the same thing. You can see the black and whites more. But part of that would be working with papers themselves, which were more brownish in color.
Another question, someone says, it sounds as if the tissue photo paper would only be used with large format negatives.
I think you're right, because it's meant to be, it could be used, 4x5, probably not smaller than 4x5. It's obviously meant to be a printing out paper, and you're putting it out in the sun just like you do printing out paper. So it definitely was meant for that purpose, rather than, it's definitely not for an enlarger.
Yes, King Schoenfeld says, do we know what sort of camera or film formats the members tended to use, because those using the printing out paper clearly used larger negatives?
Yeah. I only have the Eastman camera, the information about the Eastman camera of Koike. I do have Koike's and Matsushita's negatives, which are like this. They're not quite postcard size, so they were larger there. And I'm assuming others probably had larger formats from the time, but they were carrying their cameras, so they're not going to be that big.
How were they mounted and displayed in a salon, for example? How would they be?
Well, he talks about using white paste. We do have in our collection, we do have photographs by Kunishige that clearly were for exhibition. They have exhibition tags on the back of them, so they're in mats. I think that Narcissus photo that I showed you of Matsushita is also on a mat and has exhibition tag on the back of it. So we have some examples of that. And then we have for Koike, which we have an enormous amount of stuff. We have his negatives, his albums, and then his exhibition prints, and then regular prints. And Koike's albums are just amazing, because you flip through all those exhibition tags. You have to pick them up. What I showed only showed the top, but when you pick them up and you keep counting and you keep seeing all the places that he showed his work at, it's amazing. So we do have examples kind of different parts of it. For some people, all we have is a Christmas card, and I put in the chat, you will see I put a link to the finding aid for the Koike collection. And if you scroll down through the Koike collection, you will find listed the different people from all over the world who sent him Christmas or season's greetings cards. And if you see a link, then you can link to it to go to our digital site and see the actual image. We don't have all of them scanned, but there are a number of the Christmas cards. So that is, for some of the members and for some people, the only example that we have of their work, because they sent a card with a photo on it.
I think this is Ben asking, so what would the activities of a camera club be? Or what was an early club other than the Seattle Camera Club?
You mean just a regular camera club? Before the Seattle Camera Club, or the activities of the Seattle Camera Club?
I was curious in general, two parts. One was, what is a camera club? Because I kind of think I know what it is, but I've never been in one. And then number two, was there any other kind of camera club that came maybe even before Seattle Camera Club that was sort of well known? What was the first camera club?
We have a camera club was started in 1895, and it's very cool because it had women members. It was very cool. It was Seattle citizens, and it lasted, I don't know, I think maybe lasted into the early 1900s. We have almost no information on it. We just don't have much about it. But, and then this camera club started officially in 1924. And we have huge records of what this is. So the club, they would meet together. They would talk about their work. They would have different people from all over the world talk about topics about art, like Mark Toby, as I said in the thing, came and talked about art. And Glenn Hughes talked about stage lighting. And as you can see, a number of them photographed at the Cornish Institute. So they were photographing these productions, or they were photographing people, dancers and stuff. So they would talk about their work. They would talk about, they would talk about the different salons that were on. They put on these shows. So they themselves had a photographic salon each year, very, very successful, where people from all over the world, then a juried exhibition from people from all over the world. So you came, and they also went out together and photographed. So you can tell, for example, obviously, Kunishige and Ella Mcbride and Wayne Albee were out photographing at Cornish, but also they went out up into the mountains. Like I said, I have film actually of them eating sushi on the mountain and then going up and walking up on the mountain. So they would get together as kind of like friends for social activities. And in fact, there's a writer who wrote about this club a little bit. And one of the things that she pointed out was that most of the members were bachelors or did not have children. And this was their source of community. This was really their social life and source of community. So they weren't just going to their meetings, but they were photographing together and doing activities as a social thing too. But basically, you talk about your photographs. You talk about the shows, and they have a very detailed record of who showed where in the NOTAN. So they obviously at their meeting said so and so showed in Uruguay, and so got this prize from the photo era, and so they have that all detailed in the NOTAN. So clearly at their meetings, they would talk about who won an award or whatever. And that's the reason, for example, although we have no work of Hideo Onichi, he was the cook. He was a cook at the Paramount Theater. He actually was one of the most successful members. And it's even written in NOTAN that he sold in a show, he sold this amazing number of copies of his photographs. So we have this record because they put that in the NOTAN. So they probably congratulated him on selling all of those at this one show. And we know that he was successful because it's recorded in the NOTAN. And so this way, even though we may not have work from some of the people, we know about them. And like we know about Miss Onishi because she was on the cover of the NOTAN. So at least we know there was one Japanese woman who was photographing. So it's very interesting that way. Did that
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, did that explain enough to you about the club?
It's funny because, we're missing our in-person PHSNE meetings where, members will at the beginning before the speaker show things that they've brought in to share with the members. It's very social. And, like the Seattle Camera Club, we have speakers come in and present. So I see similarities, and I see, that sense of community that we have both in the in-person meetings and on Zoom lately with members who aren't local who are able to attend, which is great. And about the earlier camera club that had a lot of women members, Kodak marketed to women. There was the Kodak girl. All the brochures and everything would often feature an illustration of a woman holding a box camera or a folding camera early on. So it was something that I think is naturally that there were a lot of amateur photographers who were women in clubs. And Ron says that he thinks the Boston Camera Club began in 1881 and is still active. So it's generally thought to be the second oldest club in the US. And there are a few more questions. Reich asks, how would you characterize the pictorialist aesthetic vis-a-vis the Japanese traditions?
Well, there was a lot of of overlap because of the sense of emotionalism, the design, the rather than what we call straight photography, where everything is crisp and sharp and whatever. There was this sense of ambiance or emotion within this type of aesthetic, and it fit perfectly with the Japanese aesthetic, and also the fact that the Japanese aesthetic is more flat. The shadows and everything are flat. You can see that in Ella Mcbride's work, where there's not this depth to it. There's this sort of more flat looking to it. And it's very interesting to me that Ella Mcbride was very Japanese in her aesthetic, which makes sense because she was working with Frank Kunishige and Shuichi Tsunami. Although Frank Kunishige was far less Japanese in his aesthetic, but so I find it very interesting, this crossover.
Another question from King Schoenfeld, who asks, in view of the historical antipathy to Asians in Seattle and Tacoma before 1900, do you think that the work of the Seattle Club was in part political, like a strategy to introduce Japanese citizens positively?
No, absolutely not. I don't think it had to do with politics. This was a bunch of people who absolutely loved photography, and they got together and they talked photography, and they did photography, and they talked photography, and then they said, well, we should have a group. And they always were open to Caucasians being members, and I think more the racism would be that you didn't have very many Caucasian members, although there were some who were members, but these were people who loved photography. And that is all up and down the West Coast, these camera clubs. This wasn't just Seattle, this was up and down the West Coast. And I believe that this was a good way, and as I said, for them to be able to participate in the American culture, but not have to speak perfect English. You know, they had an aesthetic, they had something to say in their photography that they could share with other people around the nation or in their community. So I don't think it had anything to do with a political stance. These are people who just loved photography.
Mary Panzer has another question. Did they make lantern slides? And if yes, did they participate in the Camera Club slide exchange?
No, as far as I know, in any record, I have not seen anything about making lantern slides.
She also says that there are many camera clubs that got started in the early 1880s when dry plates became available. But in the 1860s, the Amateur Photographic Exchange Club of Philadelphia included members from all over the East Coast. They made stereo cards. And was there any connection between Clarence White and the Seattle Camera Club?
I have not seen any. It doesn't mean there wouldn't have been, but in looking, a lot of the connections we know about are because of the Christmas cards. So from all these pictorialists all over the world, and things that are written in the notan of people who visited, like Ruzicka, who was apparently the leading pictorialist in New York City. So we know that because we have that listed there. But as far as I know, I don't know of any recorded connection with him. But on the other hand, a lot of the cards may have been thrown away. One unfortunate thing about the archive is that when this collection came in, which was before my time, some of it was gotten rid of by somebody after Monroe's time. And so, for example, part of Iwao Matsushi's films were gotten rid of. And so we don't have a complete, I don't know what was there. Oh, I'll tell you something interesting about Iwao Matsushi's films. He was literally picked up hours after Pearl Harbor happened, and they took his film, the FBI took his films, And his films are of his cats and of climbing Mount Rainier, and absolutely nothing that has to do with anything. And another thing also about him being picked up, he was in this internment camp for years asking to be moved to Minidoka so he could be with his wife and friends. And they got down to something like 28 people and they still wouldn't let him go. And there is a series of letters that he wrote to his wife back and forth. And it was turned into a book called Interned Apart. And it's very, very interesting. And ironically, this is a guy who absolutely loved America. So the irony of him being picked up as a danger is, it's a very sad thing.
Yeah. Do you have, how much correspondence from the camps do you have in the collection?
We have all the letters between Koike and Koike and Matsushita, and his wife Hanaya and Matsushita. So we have quite a bit. There's quite a bit of stuff there.
Could you talk a little bit about photo archives and how you go about processing a giant, say someone comes to you with photographs that need to be restored or they're in bad condition, or you have to decide which ones are not savable, like if something is completely deteriorated. What is that like when you first start working on a collection that might have been received like that?
Well, you actually asked two different questions, so I should clarify. One of your questions is about materials that are deteriorating.
Mm-hmm.
Is your other question about what you do in a photo archive?
No, like how do you go about processing a collection? Like what would be your methodology? How would you go about cataloging them? Because
well, what we do is, like for example, when you look at the Koike collection, you can see the finding aid. We take a collection and we look at it and you see if there's any intrinsic organization to it. Is there a numbering system? For example, Koike has albums that his photos are in, so we kept it in that organization.
mm-hmm.
Some photographers have literally no organization, so you have to figure out a way to organize them so that the researcher, you just don't have random stuff. So you look for intrinsic or original order if you can find it. In the case, for example, of Koike, we have his albums, then we have his loose photographs, we have the Christmas card. Those are all in different series, what are called series. So that if you're interested in the Christmas cards, you don't have to look through the entire finding aid, you can just look at the Christmas cards. We even have, by the way, his trophies, and we have the box that the Camera Club would send prints out in as part of that collection. It's actually processed into the collection. So we do what's called intellectual arrangement, which is we take the collection and arrange it in some manner that it makes some kind of sense. And for example, for newspaper collections, they're basically already arranged because a newspaper collection is chronological. You would be crazy to tear it apart and do different things to it. You know, a newspaper collection is chronological. But there are many ways to arrange collections, but we do this intellectual arrangement. Once we've done that, we then describe the images in the collection. And for us, we scan, if it's a small collection, we scan the whole collection. If it's a large collection, we scan selections from it, and we put that in our digital site. So you can see, you're able to see what's in the collection. And so then it's put out there for the researchers to use.
it's just now that things are available digitally online for researchers to see without having to travel necessarily to visit the collection, it allows you to explore them in more detail than you would have before if you weren't able to travel to the collection. And since as a librarian, I do the same thing with our photo collection, which was in no order except for a few random boxes here and there in all different types of formats. What about if you display items from the collection? Are you taking care to limit the amount of light that they're exposed to?
We don't display because we're an archive, but we do loan to museums all over the nation, actually, and internationally. And they have to give us their plan. They have to send a detailed, their lighting plan And so they send detailed information about how they exhibit the materials. We work very closely. There's a new museum here called the Cascadia Museum, which focuses on regional art. And we have had work from our collection in almost every exhibit that they've had. And I work closely with the person who's the curator. In fact, the person who's the curator there is David Martin, who did the other essay in our book. And I work very closely together with him on that. Oh, and to answer your question about things that are deteriorating, you do a certain amount of weeding collections. There are things that you get in collections that are not useful or that have deteriorated. They're just gone. You can't save them. And so there is a certain level of weeding things out. Now that's generally things like a lot of duplicates. Like, for example, one time I had a collection that had something like 46 duplicate prints. We're just not going to keep 46 duplicate prints. You know, we keep several, but we're not going to keep them all. So, or there might be a collection of photographs which have to do with Seattle streets, and for some inexplicable reason, there's an unidentified baby in the collection. We will most likely weed that out. If things are deteriorating, we do have a conservation lab, although we don't have the money to take everything to our conservation lab. But like, for example, they're actually working on the Kunishige collection as we speak and making boxes and folders and things to protect that collection. We got a grant, and so they're making housing for it to protect it better because it's not protected as well as it should be. So sometimes something is just deteriorated. If you have a nitrate negative that's deteriorating, you have to get rid of it. There's nothing you can do. If you can print it, you're lucky. But if it's on its way, and I've seen massive amounts of nitrate deterioration. Actually, it's one of my favorite deteriorations because of what it does. It's very, very interesting what it does. And I've seen lots and lots and lots of deteriorated nitrate.
A few more questions. Ben asks, how did you first hear of the Camera Club? Was it through your work at UW?
Oh, yes. So the work, what's kind of interesting is that, yes, the Camera Club, we have the Matsushita collection and the Koike and Kunishige, and we have the papers. So I learned about it when I came there. And what's interesting is that David Martin had always been very, very interested in the Camera Club, but nobody in my position. I should point out, I'm the first person in my position who actually has training in visual stuff. And the people who were in charge of the photographs have been historians or people with backgrounds that were not visual. So I was the first person who really showed this interest, which is why we got together and we did the book and the exhibit and everything, because I was very, very interested and very excited. And one thing I should point out, one of the things is that really you couldn't have done much with it until the prejudice against pictorialism finally flowed out of the system. I started in fine art photography when it was very much straight photography, and everybody would poo-poo pictorialism. So the curator, we had our show in 2011, and the woman who was the curator of the Henry Art Museum, who put it on, told us that when she was hired there, she told a friend of hers, well, I'll never do this exhibit or that exhibit. And one of the two things she said she would never do would be pictorialism. So there was this strong prejudice against pictorialism. So it's kind of interesting because it was the right timing. We finally have moved past that prejudice so people can look at pictorialist photography in a more enlightened way. And so I hooked up with David, and we kept talking about how we really wanted to do something about the club. And I think it's an amazing story too. It's amazing lost history, you know.
Yeah, I can see how in the past museums and libraries or archives have different collecting strategies, you know, and how an archive or a library might want to focus on more documentary artifacts, thinking that that was where the information was. And in in many collections with amateur photography, like the one I'm working on, plenty of the local photographers were experimenting with different types of artistic expression, not just photographs of documentary type scenes. And while we have a lot of architectural photography that documents the town before, a lot of the buildings were gone, there are beautiful landscapes, and just, from about that period too, and nothing quite as pictorialist. Yeah. But you can definitely see people using a painterly eye to see what's around them and capture it with the camera.
Yeah, part of the problem with archives is that in general, archives were run by librarians who have no training whatsoever with photographs, and photographs were always relegated to just that thing in, at the end of all the papers. And so the kind of attitude toward photography, or what they would choose to collect, was very much not focused on someone who has a more aesthetic view of photography. I was trained as a fine art photographer, so I have both experience working in archives and with fine art photography. So I can look at photography and say, it's got this value and that value and that value, so I'll collect this. It is astounding that Robert Monroe took this material. It is astounding because really an archive wouldn't have taken it, because and you can see the person who was there before me turned down these Ella Mcbride photos that we should have, saying we don't collect art. But Robert Monroe was just so ahead of his time. He was able to see the value of this. And had they offered this stuff to an art museum, they would have turned it down because it was pictorialist photography. So it would have gone in the trash because they had no heirs. These people did not have children.
And the whole idea of visual literacy for people working in libraries and archives is important, like how you just explained it. And the fact that you do have a background in fine art photography, I think marries really well with the way you wrote the book and chose the images. And Reich has a question. There's one image in the presentation of tree branches with clouds in the background. Oh. Who is the photographer?
Matsushita. I can bring it up again. Okay. Matsushita is my, although he wasn't, he didn't win as many awards, he did exhibit a lot. Oh, come on. How can I not get, well, we'll do it this way. Matsushita is my favorite photographer of the club. There we go. And this, by the way, is not a very good slide.
That's it.
Unfortunately, it's not a very good slide. It's got more color in it. It's not so washed out. But Matsushita did this. And I have to tell you why he's my favorite photographer. That's because we share a birthday.
That's great.
But, and he, of course, is the reason that we have this material. It's such a wonderful serendipitous thing that these three collections came together. And then, fortunately, that he met up with Robert Monroe. It's just, it shows you how people don't realize how much of gatekeepers we are in archives. People don't actually know we're sitting on the history, and if you don't take this history, it's not there.
Yeah.
And I can tell you that Dennis Reed, who worked really, really hard in California when he did the Japanese American photography show in 1988, he went through everything he could find that listed names of these photographers, anything that he could find. And they looked up all these names in the phone book, and they went to all these people to find out. And oftentimes the people would be like the granddaughter or son, didn't even know that their father was a photographer. And in one case, he was in a greenhouse and the person brought these bags of photographs out from the back of the greenhouse that turned out to be from a photographer who was, you know, a member of one of the West Coast camera clubs. And part of that is because their work was destroyed or they wanted to hide. Some of the photographers actually burned their work so they wouldn't be seen, you know, as anti-American. So it's pretty amazing. And Dennis Reed really has to be commended for what he did find, what he was able to uncover, which still isn't anywhere near what we have. We are very lucky.
Ben, how are we doing on time?
I think we're doing fine on time. It was a great presentation by Nicolette. That was so much fun to watch. And Dana, I think if you want to maybe open up the floor for a general conversation in the next few minutes, and maybe we could try to kind of have everybody off by 9 o'clock. I think that would be great.
That sounds good. So Nicolette, we're going to open up people unmuting who might be able to ask questions. If you guys want to switch to gallery view or speaker view, either one, whatever suits you. The person who's speaking in speaker view will be largest on the screen, and gallery view, you'll be able to see everyone. And so anybody have anything to share? Oh, I also want to say Mary Panzer, who's with us tonight, is presenting for us in March. Mary, would you like to share a little bit about what you're going to be presenting on?
Sure, hold on. This has been a really fantastic presentation. There's so many different, very inspiring. So I hope I can meet Nikki's standard next month. But I'm going to talk about a work that came out of another archive that was almost lost. But it's a kind of photography that has people in the street who use cameras, take pictures of people, and then hand them a card and say,
"Oh yes,
it's
yes,
been photographed. And
yes.
if you give me 50 cents, I'll send you 2 copies." This way of making pictures was done from the 1930s to the 1970s. And since I got to see this huge archive at the Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester, I've been thinking about it. So there turns out this was done all over the world, Istanbul, Poland, Marseille, Colombia, South America, and Vancouver.
Nicolette,
I have some.
Oh, you do?
I have some of those photos in my collection where
Ooh,
they're
I
always,
can't wait.
you know, they're vertical postcards, the people walking down the street. It's really great. They're really interesting.
I'll be interested to share this stuff with you in a month. Please come.
Nicolette, I wanted to ask about the way that the book came about. You have several books, but this one in particular, you were working with, you said David Martin?
Yes, right.
So did the two of you decide to do the project together, or what was the?
Yes, no, we decided to do it together, and I allowed him to get first. I let him have first booking, you know, so his name comes first, his essay comes first. But no, we both were working on this. We decided to do this, and ironically, we did the book before we had the exhibit. That's what helped us get the exhibit to go at the Henry, which was amazing exhibit. It was an enormous, huge exhibit. But yes,
did any of our members see the exhibit? Is there anyone who saw it?
They would have to have been out here.
Yeah. Anybody have any questions that they would like to share? Unmute yourselves.
I can't help asking, Nicolette, I think that's Wisconsin Dells in the background from your Wisconsin.
You're right. You are right. Yes, that's the Bennett photo. Because I worked at, you know, one of my books is the Wisconsin Sesquicentennial Rephotographic Project. I was the visual materials curator for Wisconsin Historical Society before I came out here. And I worked with, during that time in 1998, what had happened is that the Bennett studio had been in the same hands since right after the Civil War, but the family, the children, like the great-grandchildren, did not want to run the studio anymore. And so it was given to the Historical Society, lock, stock, and barrel, the whole studio, which is now a historic site, all the original cameras and negatives and all that kind of stuff. And so the photo collection came to us, which I got. And so as a part of this, yeah, that photo is from the Bennett studio. And one of the things that's in my book, the Rephotographic Survey book, is that the very famous, most famous H.H. Bennett photo is this man jumping from this one tall rock to another tall rock, that stand rock, and it looks really scary. And that is reenacted. If you go down the river now, you can go down the river and you can see the Wisconsin Dells, and you stop, and then they reenact that. And so in the rephotography book, we have a picture of everybody photographing that as the rephotograph, a whole bunch of people sitting there rephotographing that.
I
But
just
yeah,
love.
that was very smart of you to see that that was.
Good eye. Good eye. Does anybody else have anything that they would like to share? Ben?
I've got a question. For me, I always think that everyone else has sort of the same hobbies I have because we're all in PHSNE. So that means that just like me, everyone loves collecting Sears cameras and Canon cameras. But I realize I actually have kind of a niche. So what I'm really wondering for you is, besides the Seattle Camera Club stuff, like as a personal collector, do you find yourself like being able to turn it off and leave the archiving at work, or do you like to bring everything home and kind of collect everything like the rest of us?
Well, I'll tell you a story about when I was at Wisconsin. So I was at work, and then I left work and I went to a photographer's meeting, and then where I met the guy who worked for me, who was there. And, you know, it's just sort of a part of your life. I collect photos. So yeah, it's sort of, I love to think about them. I like to write about them. I did put this link to Loss of Vision, which is my favorite writing I did because I get to trash these critics, which was really, really fun. So I love thinking about that. And I love teaching people about, I do teach people right now. I'm actually teaching a Zoom class, which is very interesting because it was completely hands-on and now we've changed it to Zoom. You know, getting people to see photos and understand photos really, really is fun. So I sort of love every part of it, except digital cameras. I despise digital cameras. But other than that.
Again, there are links to Nicolette's books in the chat, and also the finding aids for the collection. So if you go to the chat at the top or at the bottom, you can find those links and visit the collection.
And you're always welcome. Did you put my email in too?
Yes, your email is at the top of that group of information. So if anyone has questions, you can reach.
Yeah, you're always welcome to email me. I mean, I love thinking about photography and learning about it. I want to attend Mary's talk. It sounds really interesting. You know, it's just something that it's fun to do, to think about, and there's so much there. You know, it's so broad. It's such a broad topic that it sort of never ends. You know.
Dana, I think this would be a great time for everyone to unmute and get ready to give Nicolette a big virtual round of applause, because I think that was just such a well done presentation. So thank you so much, Nicolette.
Yes.
Yeah, it was great.
I'm so glad that
Absolutely.
you joined us.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
was
you very
fun.
much. Yes, thank you, Nicolette. Great presentation. Just a quick question for the PHSNE admins. Do you think you continue these talks after the quarantining is over? Because it's really a great way to be able to get speakers that are not from the local area.
We're all on that page right now.
Okay, great.
Yes,
Well-
and PHSNE puts out a newsletter, which is also available online at phsne.org, PHSNE.org. It's called Snapshots. You can read about upcoming presentations. You can look at past newsletters. There's usually a feature about the presentation that's upcoming on the front page. And so you can take a look at our schedule that way. And Mary will be with us next month. And yeah, I mean, what do people think about continuing these online, even if we go back to in-person meetings?
Yes, please do.
Yes, the issue is is definitely an element and a history of PHSNE having in-person presentations, and the camaraderie of that in-person experience was very viable, very tangible. And so we're trying to balance the two. We have not come up with a decision yet. It depends on how long the pandemic continues and things like that. I will also mention that we have been publishing our presentations on YouTube. If you would like to see any of the past.
Fantastic. Well, that's a great idea. I think you can really grow the group if people start, sharing in other film and, photography groups in social media.
Yes, and we have members in PHSNE from all over the country, some international members currently. So, people are able to attend who normally wouldn't be able to, which is great.
Both from a standpoint of, time zones in the US and Canada and that sort of thing, but also in Europe. So that's a big deal. That's really a big deal. And it's one of the reasons why they're recording these sessions, these presentations, really, provides a blanket coverage of what we do each month. Gotta say it, Nicolette, you did a fabulous job explaining this. It just really is moving to know how the depth and intensity of those Japanese American photographers in the 20s. It's really remarkable. Who knew? You've revealed that to us, something I never knew about.
One thing that really touched with me too was when you talked about how the club had to close during 1929 due to the circumstances outside of their control, the Great Depression. And it reminded me, of course, of what we're going through here now. So I'm glad we've been able to kind of pull together and make sure that we have tools available to us. It's been working out well, but it really pulled at the heartstrings when I heard that part of the story. That was really touching.
Yeah.
And the book itself is wonderful. So if people would like to investigate having their own copy, it's really a lovely, lovely book. And are you working on any other projects like that right now?
I had someone who asked me to work with him on a history of early Washington photography. So we talked about having about 5 chapters, and I offered to work on a chapter on portraiture, which I want to use actually sort of as a history of photography, starting with daguerreotype, ambrotype, tintype, and so on, so that it's not just about there's this portrait or that portrait, but weave it into the history of photography, and which works out perfectly because when you come to the end of the 1800s, then you have the amateur camera. So you then there's that different explosion, but we're only going to do up the 19th century.
Anyone else have anything they would like to share or comment on? Is the archive open right now? You guys are closed, is that correct?
We are closed to the public. In fact, we're closed to ourselves. We're all working from home. We are not, we're only allowed to go in every now and then for a couple hours to change out our work. And there only can be a certain number of people. So there'll be like 3 people and you don't see each other. It's very weird. You're in a big building and you can't, you really don't see each other, but you get to go in for a couple hours and do some work and then leave. So yes, we have people, I can't tell you how many people have written and said, well, I can come and help you look. It's like, we can't even go into the building. And, people, we've had to tell people that now since last March,
Right.
but because we're still not open. At this point in time, we finally got to be able to resume our reproduction services. So there is a person who works for me, who gets to go in and do the photos that people want to get reproductions of. Before, we could only use reproductions that we had in our image bank. So it's tricky. We probably will not be able to go back into our building at least until June maybe or so. And I know that patrons won't be back in the building before then.
Yeah. Are the reproductions done from digital?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're done digitally. So, yeah. So we do at least have that, but it is quite difficult because normally, unfortunately, this person has to go track down the photos wherever they are. And normally there's a student who's an assistant who helps find them and everything. So unfortunately, she ends up having to do all this work because she's the only one who could be in there. So, and we have to sign an attestation that we don't have COVID and all kinds of stuff if we're actually going in the building. So it's quite complicated, but I'm glad to live in a state where they're pretty obsessive about it because I'd rather not get COVID. So, if I have to put up with this, we'll put up with this. So one thing, can I tell you an archival story? Are you up for very short archival story? So one of the things that I do, I talked about being a gatekeeper. And one of the things is I used to, until COVID, have a budget to buy photos. And so I would buy photos that I think never would come to the archive. And a year or so ago, 2 years ago, I bought this little collection of 9 photos of Sea Home. It was called Sea Home. And so I started to get them ready recently to process the little collection. And I started researching Sea Home, which didn't exist. I couldn't find it anywhere. And so there was one person's name associated with these photos. And I looked this guy up and I found, weirdly, in a genealogical website on a person who was not that person, but I found this story on that site, which is that this person who was a surveyor, this land is right next to La Push on the coast. And this person who was a surveyor found this land that didn't exist. And so he surveyed this land that was written up as being in the ocean. And because of that, in 1907, these 3 families went to and established this little community of Sea Home. And these are photographs of this little community of Sea Home, which is these 3 families and their houses and their school and everything. But they only lasted a few years because they had to drag everything up this cliff to get it to Sea Home. There were no roads or anything into it. So this is a selection of photographs of a lost Washington town. that nobody knows about because, of course, they left it, abandoned it. And I found this little collection of a town that, and I actually wrote to the state historian to see if he knew anything about it, and he'd never heard of it. So it was this wonderful uncovering lost Washington history, kind of like, you know, the Japanese Camera Club, but in this case, this little tiny community. And that's one of the fun things about archives.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree. There's nothing better than opening a box when you don't know what's in it.
Yeah.
I think we're about at the end of our time. If people want to greet and say hello to each other, Ben, do we have time to people to unmute and do that for a minute or two?
By all means, yes.
Yes.
I see Larry's here. We've got Vladimir. Okay. I see some of the regulars here. So
Yeah, and welcome to anyone who's here for the first time.
I'll say hi to Susan and Lynn and Arlene. They're my guests.
welcome, Susan, Lynn, and Arlene.
Yes, welcome.
Good job, Nicolette.
I have some short question to Nicolette, if I may. Nicolette, have you heard of Aviation Museum in Washington?
Oh, the museum.
Vancouver, Washington?
I don't know about Vancouver, but we have the Museum of Flight here in Seattle.
No, it was Vancouver. Vancouver, yeah. I'm asking because a long time ago, a Soviet pilot crossed the ocean and he landed in Vancouver. His name was Chkalov.
Was it Vancouver, Washington or Vancouver, British Columbia?
No, Vancouver, Washington.
Oh.
Yeah. And I heard and I read that on internet somewhere that, that there is no museum for that pilot in Soviet Union or Russia today, but there is a museum for that flight in the United States.
Oh, it could be. It could be. I don't know of an aviation museum in Vancouver, but it's possible there is one and I just don't know about it.
It's very interesting fact, I think.
Yes.
That that flight was appreciated here, but not in the fatherland or motherland, whatever it is, for the pilot.
Oh. Yeah.
Yeah. And one more thing, you mentioned the photographers used Kodak cameras made in Rochester, right?
Yes.
Yes. Those days, I think, were already available German cameras with a better resolution. And that could make the black and white more black and more white.
Mm-hmm.
Probably.
Susan says there's an aviation museum in Hood River, Oregon.
But that's pretty far away.
But that's Oregon. That pilot landed in Vancouver.
Yeah, Vancouver is
There's
on the border.
I just found a Pearson Air Museum in Vancouver, Washington.
That could be that.
Pearson Air Museum.
And the last name for that pilot is Chkalov. So it's spelled CHKALOV. Yes.
Were there any aerial photographs that were part of the Seattle Camera Club? No one did any aviation photographs.
No.
No, he didn't do anything those days. But he was the first to cross the ocean. So it's kind of historical event.
Nicolette, I'm sorry.
There was a photograph in the slideshow of weren't there airplanes in the shot?
Yes, he was looking up.
Yes, no, I realize, but you know.
Yeah, those were small airplanes, biplanes, and those planes are unable fly for such a long distance.
That photograph would have been taken actually close to where I live. I live near Sandpoint Naval Base, which was actually an airfield, and is now a public park. But at that time, it was actually an airfield, and so they probably were flying into the Sandpoint Naval Base.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, it was lovely seeing all of the images, and I feel like I've been there almost in the archive to be able to. I love the selections, and it's such a great collection. I don't think many people knew about it, and I love that there's a book that people can have in their own collection. So thank you.
I'm going to say goodbye, and one more time, thank you, Nicolette.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good night, Larry.
Okay.
Nicolette, thanks again. I'm going to sign off. I appreciate your talk. And Dana, thank you. Ben, thank you. Have a good evening.
You too. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Nicolette.
All right. I guess this is about good night for everyone. And thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Nicolette. And yes, come join us next month.
And thank you for making it possible.
Great job. Thank you,
It's
Nicolette.
a very great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night,
Bye.
everyone.